Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming out on this glorious blue sky February day. It's a great day to get together and hear about the blues. I am Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. We're in the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium for History is Lunch. If you have not already, please silence your cell phones. A couple of announcements about upcoming events. The Natchez Literary and Cinema Celebration is co-sponsored by the Department of Archives and History. That starts at the end of next week in Natchez. And then the Mississippi Historical Society annual meeting is the following week in Natchez. You can pick up one of these over there and register for it, or you can go to mississippihistory.org and register online. Got a great lineup for both of those, and hope that we'll see some of you for that. Tomorrow, American Book Award winner Valeria Luiselli will read from and sign copies of her new book from 5 to 7 p.m. at the Eudora Welty House and Garden Education and Visitors Center. That should be great. We're looking forward to that. And on February 26th, the new exhibit, For the Record, Music, Storytelling, and Eudora Welty will open in the Visitor Center. This exhibit highlights the songs, artists, and albums that appeared in and inspired Eudora Welty's writing. That's free. It will be up for a while, so come by and check that out when you get a chance. And then on Thursday, February 21st at noon at the Manship House Museum, Jeff Klingfuss will explore the importance of domestic household guides in the Victorian era with forgotten foodways from Mrs. Beeton to Martha Stewart. And those programs can fill quickly, so you can reserve a seat by contacting the Manship House. There's some flyers out about it over there as well with contact information. And then finally, I hope that you will join us next week for History's Lunch when Natalie and James Adams will be with us to discuss their new book, Just Trying to Have School, The Struggle for Desegregation in Mississippi. Before I forget, we have cupcakes in addition to our normal cookies today, and that was due to the clever thinking of Nathan Weber, who is sort of the unsung hero of the series because he keeps us fed and in coffee and water. So when you see him, wish him happy birthday today. Today, we are delighted to have with us Kevin Greene to discuss his new book, The Invention and Reinvention of Big Bill Broonzy. Kevin Greene is the Nina Bell Suggs Assistant Professor of History and Director of the Center for Oral History and Cultural Heritage at the University of Southern Mississippi, where he teaches courses in U.S. history, African American history, world history, research methodology, oral history, and music history. He is the principal investigator for the Mississippi Oral History Project, a research initiative funded annually by the Mississippi Legislature and the National Endowment for the Humanities to document the collective memory of Mississippi's culture, heritage, and institutions in the 20th and 21st centuries. Help me welcome Kevin Greene.
Hello? Better? There we go. All right. It's a wonderful day to be here, and I love this program. I'm so glad that so many folks turned out today. It's a really neat and special thing that the folks have at MDAH. And these two wonderful museums, I presume a lot of y'all have been through these museums. If you haven't, they're just remarkable. Conducting an oral history project right now with several institutions across the state on the creation of these two museums. And it is a remarkable and incredible story. So if you have the opportunity, please spend as much time in these places as you can. They are true treasures, not just to Mississippi and the South, but to our country. And I'm proud to be speaking here today. Thanks, Chris, for the introduction, and thanks to MDAH. I'll get in here with my talk real quick. But I first want to say I got into Big Bill Broonzy as a 14-year-old kid. In 1992, Eric Clapton went on MTV and played his acoustic guitar on MTV Unplugged. And he played one, an instrumental number, and second, a pretty famous Broonzy cover called Key to the Highway. And of course, the first concert I'd ever seen as a kid was his Journeyman tour in 1989. My parents took me to see Eric Clapton. It was, a seminal moment in my life, your first concert. and I'm a lifelong musician on top of that, so it just was special. But here's this Englishman teaching this 14-year-old kid about an Arkansas Delta bluesman who claimed to be from Mississippi. And the music that came from Clapton's guitar, I had to know immediately what it was, because I'd never heard anything like that. So my obsession with Big Bill started as a young teenager, one who was learning how to play the guitar at the time. And so I've kind of followed this journey to study Big Bill. Today I want to talk about Big Bill's. The book is long, and it's a biographical study, but it's also an academic monograph. It makes a lot of arguments, some successful, some I would probably maybe not so successful. But the book has several parts to it. Today I really want to concentrate on the third part of the book, which looks at how this guy from Arkansas, from Chicago, took blues, the black experience, African American history and culture, across the Atlantic to Europe in the wake of the Second World War, and what that means for Europeans, particularly Europeans who were jazz and blues fans, how they began to understand and investigate the black experience in the United States. And Mississippi plays an enormous role in that, because as Broonzy toured across Europe, night after night, in several different countries, from Germany to Holland to Belgium to England, and on and on and on, he not only played songs, he in a sort of pedantic way taught Europeans about what it meant to be black in the United States, what it meant to be a blues musician and a seasoned performer in the United States. So not only did he share with them his artistry, he taught them about African American history, about Mississippi history, Delta history, and his legacy and connection to that is a powerful thing. So I'm going to start. I have a script here. I'm going to read from the script, but I'll kind of go off and back and forth from it. I've got 40 minutes, so if I have to cut it short, I'll try not to be too long-winded. We'll try to save some time for questions in the end. On December 23rd, 1938, in front of a packed house in New York City's Carnegie Hall, Chicago bluesman Big Bill Broonzy and a host of other black music legends performed a live review of the history of black music in the United States, featuring spirituals, holy roller hymns, harmonica playing, blues, boogie-woogie piano, New Orleans jazz, and soft swing. The From Spirituals to Swing concert promised to educate its integrated audience about the music that nobody knows, filled with recording industry giants, music promoters, and university intellectuals, and government and academic folklorists. This event represented an important moment for the history of American music and racial integration. Organized with the political and intellectual left and promoted by members of the recording industry, an integrated audience witnessed a publicly performed history of black music in the United States up until that point. For decades, black American music had remained at the margins of American life, but was still a viable part of our cultural output. After this evening, however, black music and Big Bill Broonzy would quickly move into the mainstream of that growing music industry. And there that night are a litany of folks. Count Basie and his orchestra are there, Sister Rosetta Tharpe, the Kansas City Six, Sonny Terry, and it goes on and on and on and on. Situated as part of the blues component of that night and accompanied by James P. Johnson, we get to see Big Bill Broonzy. And he's introduced as an Arkansas sharecropper, straight out of the field, straight off the bus, into New York to perform for these folks, and he plays a number that he's just kind of written. He hasn't recorded it yet, but it's very popular. It becomes a very popular tune. And of course, he's there at Spirituals to Swing, from Spirituals to Swing, in replace of Robert Johnson. The promoters and organizers of this concert had gone out into Mississippi looking for Robert Johnson, only to find out after time that Robert Johnson had passed away. So they invited Big Bill to kind of be the Mississippi Delta blues component of this particular show. Its organizer and producer, John Hammond, had the intentions kind of to promote this rather than getting the historical accuracy correct. So he was an industrialist rather than someone who was trying there as a humanist, we should say. He told the audience that this was Broonzy's first performance as in front of a white audience, and that's kind of how he sold this, where he played one of his latest unrecorded blues. As he would countless times throughout his career, Broonzy shared the performance of the song called Just a Dream. And Just a Dream kind of symbolizes parts of Broonzy's songwriting, especially as his career evolves. He gets involved in writing socially conscious music, and he's one of the first black artists to kind of record these songs, particularly in the 1940s and through the 1950s, recording these types of socially conscious blues songs. This song, Just a Dream, reflects his kind of taking his artistic representation of the realities of black life and the disappointment felt by African Americans as they loved and upheld a country that refused to grant them full citizenship. The song is about him having this dream, and part of the dream sequence is he goes to the White House and he's meeting the president, and they're sitting on the porch talking about these issues, these social issues in Chicago and in the South, and then only to realize that it's just a dream and something like that is never possible. Hammond had intended for the crowd to witness the majesty of the country blues that evening, but instead, those in the audience kind of heard the bedrock arrangement that made up Chicago's blues sound, and also the performance of an evolving black consciousness within this particular artist. And it's a fascinating moment for Big Bill because there are several things that are happening. This is a big concert. This is a big moment for the kind of meshing of African American music styles with an academic, government kind of folklore crowd that's interested in this, not just because of its musical qualities, but as a part of the fabric of their growing social consciousness and understanding race in the United States. On top of that, there's one of the first integrated music clubs is opening in Greenwich Village in New York, right down the street. So once the show is finished, they want Big Bill to come out with them after the show and go out into New York and perform and go to this club and experience this kind of changing racial consciousness within this music community in New York. So when they go looking for him after the show, he's gone. He disappeared like just a flash. They can't find him anywhere. They're kind of scrambling to look for him. And what Big Bill had done is he went in, he did the gig, he left, he went outside, walked a few blocks down the street, caught a bus back to Chicago because it was December 23rd. On December 24th and December 25th, his best friend and one of the most important musicians of Chicago's blues community, Hudson Whitaker, also known as Temper Red, it was his birthday. And every year, they got together and cooked this big meal, drank homemade liquor, beer, and beat the hell out of Temper Red because that's what they did. And that was, so he was in such a hurry to leave this sort of seminal moment, he got on the bus and he disappeared and they couldn't find him. And come to find out, he had not gone back to Arkansas to go home for Christmas like they thought, but he actually went back to Chicago. I use that story as a juxtaposition about who Big Bill is. On the one hand, he's introduced to this academic New York audience for the first time as a symbol of the country Delta Mississippi blues. But on the other hand, Big Bill in 1938 had been living in Black Chicago, State Street, South Side Chicago, for almost 20 years. And he was part of this emerging and important Chicago blues community filled with these urban, sophisticated artists who are using the burgeoning recording industry and their music to engage with new types of black consciousness. And I argue in the book, and I'm not going to spend time on that today, Big Bill Broonzy, through this type of interaction, symbolizes the new Negro movement that's happening in Chicago at the time. He is transforming his personality, his identity. He's willing to work for these academic and concert promoter types on the one hand as this sort of country rube, but he's a sophisticated urban black performer who has recorded hundreds of songs up to this point and is one of the most respected bluesmen in Chicago's South Side community. And I love the juxtaposition between those two because that's what my book is all about, is really looking at the way artists develop their identities in the pre-World War II era of a constantly and continually evolving music industry and culture of black popular music. And as those two forces interchange with each other, black artists are often forced to kind of transform who they are, but on their own terms. And as they do this, they begin to define how we understand black music, how we understand the history of the recording industry, and the like. And so I really love that sort of anecdote, and it's kind of one of the reasons I start there. Let me find my, so here's a picture of Big Bill. At about, this is Big Bill somewhere around the 1920s. And I hope you see in this image, this guy is not the sort of itinerant, ragged, sort of tawdry Delta blues player hopping on trains from town to town across the Delta. He's a really sophisticated player. This is actually a marketing photo, a marketing campaign photo of where whatever particular record company he was working for at the time. This is part of his PR campaign. And he is a highly sophisticated performer and rubbing elbows with some serious musicians. The Great Migration pulled Broonzy to Chicago, where he transformed his country fiddling into a sophisticated urban blues. After decades as a black popular artist who had pioneered the Chicago blues sound, he became a hip down-home folkster, a vanguard of the emerging folk music revival of the 1950s, embodying its fascination with classic blues, especially the blues from Mississippi. And what I want to talk about today, as his career evolves again in its sort of ending stage or latter stage, he becomes something else. He becomes a touchstone for Europeans' absorption of the understanding of African American music, particularly blues and jazz in the first half of the 20th century. Broonzy embodies, I argue in the book, the pressures of celebrity and the effort to please across racial and national class and cultural lines. And because of this, when you kind of look at his career, Big Bill offers us a pathway to understand how musicians shaped the black experience as cultural architects under the weight of Jim Crow. Over his long career, almost 40-year career, he achieved escalating levels of renown among varying groups as an in-demand guitarist, a songwriter, an accompanist, a live performer, a talent scout. He crisscrossed Europe, he went to Africa, he crisscrossed the United States. It's a very powerful example of many artists of the pre-war era that have been lost in some cases to history, and there's a lot of reasons why, and I kind of go into the book about one of the reasons why we don't know as much about these particular figures. Big Bill would eventually become one of the most prolifically recorded blues artists of the pre-war era, selling tens of thousands of records across the United States, and becoming one of Chicago's urban blues pioneers. As his career evolved again, he eventually would achieve a celebrity that most just never can. And that is to teach the celebrity and renown to teach the generation that comes after you. Anybody recognize the gentleman on the right here? That's Muddy Waters, and that's in Chicago in 1940. And that's Big Bill, welcoming in, as he would say, the young blood to Chicago to become a part of this growing blues culture. And this is right after Alan Lomax finds Muddy in the Delta and Rolling Fork and says, you got to go up Chicago, because there's some stuff happening there. And one of the first people that he meets is Big Bill. Now, and just in terms of an anecdote, this is around 1941, 1942. Any electric guitar players out here? Well, Muddy Waters is an incredible electric guitar player, if you know his music. The first person he ever saw play an electric guitar was Big Bill Broonzy. It was Big Bill that kind of inspired him. He introduced him to club owners, recording agents, recording studios. He took him around State Street and around Bronzeville and introduced him to this community in a way that no one had ever mentored him before. And Big Bill became that figure. And I think it's really important part of who Big Bill was. So I make the argument that Broonzy's career demonstrates that a musician's talent and his skill alone did not make for the type of success that he experienced. It was often difficult for him and financially challenging as he traveled around the country and the world, frequently separated from his friends and family. Yet Broonzy understood that he could find and sustain celebrity, renown, and success by reinventing himself, by constantly kind of changing who he was, changing his approach to his music, talking to new audiences, finding young talent to help he would open up and share gigs with Muddy Waters, especially as he was coming up. Quite successfully and without precedent, Broonzy transformed himself across all of his career and became what today we would consider an international icon for the blues. A few years ago, the BBC put out a documentary on Big Bill, and it's a really good one about his importance and impact to Europe as he starts to tour there beginning in the 1950s. And that's really where my talk is going to shift today. But before we get there, Big Bill was born Lee Conley Bradley on June 26th, sometime around the turn of the century, in and around the Arkansas-Mississippi Delta. Now, if y'all know the famous oral historian Studs Terkel, he was a really good friend with Big Bill, and he always said Big Bill told one truth, and that's Big Bill's truth. So there's a lot of stories about Big Bill, the origin stories for Big Bill. Born in Arkansas, we know, we're not real sure when. Several kind of legal documents, empirical documents say 1893. Some of them say 1898. There's a family ledger that says 1903. There's a census data that says 1908. His death certificate, I mean, it just goes on and on and on. Now, we know there's some legal documentation in Arkansas that say that this man, Lee Bradley, was born to this family. But then again, Big Bill convinced the world that he was from Scott, Mississippi. So this is who he was, a master storyteller and a self-promoter, and not unlike how many artists across the 20th and 21st centuries who changed their names and their identities and who they are and where they're from. And I would say he's an harbinger for that type of thing moving forward. So he's born it's somewhere on June 26, somewhere 1893, 1903, wherever it is. And one of the reasons that folks have kind of debated where he's born and when he's born is because they're trying to challenge the veracity of his military service. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. He was the fourth and final boy of 10 children. He grew up within a poor and relatively stable sharecropping family with roots in slavery in the era of Reconstruction. By 1910, the family had moved to Lake Dick, Arkansas, a small community near the area of Jefferson County, known today as Plum Bayou. His early childhood is difficult to substantiate and piece together, but one thing remains clear about Big Bill is he received very little formal education, and he was starting to dabble in music as a young kid, just at that moment when the blues, and those of you who are interested in blues history and sort of blues lore, and it's kind of the incubator stage, he's kind of born in that moment, right? So this music is near him and with him. So just as blues is emerging, he is coming of age with various instruments, and he spends his days at working as sharecropping and work. He learns how to use plows, and he'll talk about that to European audiences, the different types of plows, how to break a mule, and all these other things that Europeans, they think he's speaking Mandarin or something. They really don't know what he's talking about, and that's a really fascinating thing he does further on down the road. But at the same time, as he was coming of age in Arkansas, at the same time the United States gets embroiled in the First World War. So his first opportunity to leave Arkansas in the United States itself came during World War I. He entered the U.S. Army in 1917 as a draftee. He received basic training at Camp Pike, Arkansas, then was transported to Newport News, Virginia, and finally shipped off to Brest, France, where he told someone he didn't know where he was more than a goat. I love the story about Broonzy's service because it's pretty detailed, and I spent a lot of time in the book talking about his service. Depending upon when he was born, he could have been 20 when he was drafted, or he could have been like my grandfather, who entered the United States Armed Services, lied about his age in World War II, and entered as 16. So there's been some back and forth about how Big Bill got involved in the military, and part of this back and forth about the research of his date is to try to figure out whether he was or was not a member of the AEF. I argue that he is, because there's no really definitive proof that he isn't. Most of if you know the history of those records, World War I service records, particularly for the Army, were destroyed in a fire in St. Louis in the 1970s. So we really can't prove if he was there or not. But some of the kind of detail of the stories he tells makes me think, and I argue that he's there. And honestly, there's really no way to know if he was or he wasn't. So that's one of the historiographic debates that Broonzy scholars have about that. So in the AEF, he served as a soldier of service as a supply stationed in France. And while he was there, he had the same experience as so many African-American soldiers. He's transformed. He's pulled out of the Jim Crow South and the sort of seemingly endless juxtaposition between black labor and Jim Crow laws. And even though his experience is very difficult in World War I, it creates with him a sense of dignity that he will carry with him the rest of his life. And I argue it's one of the reasons that he leaves the South for good in 1920 and goes to Chicago, because I argue in the book that just like someone like Rayford Logan, if you know who that is, a great historian and veteran of the First World War, he transforms himself in his black consciousness into this new Negro movement and becomes a part of that as well. For the next 40 years, after he gets home from service, and he'll return like most guys in 1919, for the next 40 years, he will concentrate on issues and things that he developed in World War I. I mean, particularly challenging notions of authority, challenging these racial situations where he felt uncomfortable or where they were so overtly oppressive that he felt he had to challenge them. And that ethos, those sort of pathways make it into his music in a way that few other artists of the period did. And that's another reason I argue that I'm pretty sure he served in World War I, because he's just a different cat, as he would say, when he comes back. So from 1925, as he starts his music career, to 1958, he would record hundreds of songs. And I know I'm skipping around a bit, but it's a long book, and he's got a long life, so I want to get to his European career. From 1925 to 1958, he would record hundreds and hundreds of songs as a vocalist and a guitarist, a songwriter, accompanist, as I mentioned earlier. And one could argue, and we do, and those of you who know his music and other blues musicians of the pre-war period, often argue that he is in the top 3 of the most important blues musicians of the pre-war period for a number of reasons. One, because his career is incredibly prolific. It's just long, and his output is just insane. 2, the impact that he has on, as I showed you, Muddy Waters, those who came after him. And 3, what he does with his career as it goes through its many twists and turns. And that is, sustains it by finding new audiences, transforming his playing style, as I mentioned before, and his new identity. So, and to me, he is this incredible virtuoso. He is, and if you are a guitar player in the audience, he is an unbelievably skilled guitarist, and gets, as you know, it's like a fine wine, and you can hear it across his career. By the time he gets to the last stages of his career, he is amazing, and he's a virtuoso. So someone like me argues he's just way ahead of his time. He is a celebrity, an African-American celebrity in a time where it's difficult to be an African-American laborer, let alone someone who's able to negotiate this burgeoning recording industry, white audiences, folklore audiences, and white musicologists and intellectual circles, and a new continent where people speak different languages and have no idea about the black experience in the United States. And there are so many artists that will follow that mold after him, and it's another one of the contributions I make. So I'm going to shift here to Big Bill in France in 1952. And he's in a conversation here with Alan Lomax. Alan Lomax, if you're familiar with him, is very familiar with Mississippi, and his relationship with Alan Lomax is one of the reasons I argue in the book that Mississippi becomes his adopted home, because to Alan Lomax, the great folklorist, ethnomusicologist, jack of all trades, a controversial figure, card-carrying socialist, communist, just a fascinating guy, did a lot of his field work in Mississippi and used his experience and knowledge and, frankly, his power and kind of influence to reshape how we think about music history. He's had an enormous impact on particularly those who study music history, how we even think about how it's codified and qualified and quantified and all of that stuff. He has a fingerprint on it throughout the 20th century. And he befriends Big Bill particularly in the 1940s, and it's really in that period where Big Bill starts to adopt Mississippi as his home, because at this point, folklorists and intellectuals like Alan Lomax are telling the world that if you really want to understand the blues, you want to hear the real blues, the only true authentic place for the blues is in Mississippi, and he has a lot of reasons for doing that. But in the 1950s, Alan Lomax is on the lam, on the run from the House on Un-American Activities Committee because of his association with communism and socialism and communist sympathizing. So he's in Europe at the time, and he helps kind of organize with some promoters to get Big Bill over there in the 1950s. So this is 1952. This is I'm going to read an anecdote here. This is a couple years after Big Bill's first tour, when he first arrives. On May 13th, 1952, Big Bill and folklorist Alan Lomax are sitting in a Paris hotel room recording a 2-hour interview of songs and talk on subjects such as race pride and black culture in America and the blues, and particularly Mississippi. And eventually these anecdotes find their way into one of Lomax's most important works, one that helped define Big Bill's legacy for a generation. And that's his book, The Land Where the Blues Began. If you know that book, it's about the history of the Delta and the Delta blues in Mississippi. And by the time of that Tuesday afternoon in '52, Lomax had helped in the transformation of Broonzy's professional image and reputation as an exemplar of Mississippi Delta tradition, particularly Mississippi Delta blues tradition. And this recording session reveals a fascinating glimpse into how Broonzy was beginning to view his final career transformation. Could he begin to teach and explain to Europeans the history of black blues in the United States? Could he become the Mississippian, embody that Mississippi Delta blues tradition that he had kind of always told folks? And on this, Bill reflected. He said, the people in France are good people. They're good congregation to play to, the best people I've met in my life, and I never was treated no better nowhere in the world I've been than I've been treated in France. The people of France are just like the Negro of America. They've been pushed around, they've been done bad all their lives, they've been in sorrow, they've been in the shape of the blues all of their lives. I think the people of France is just like my people in Mississippi. Now what he's talking about is World War I and World War II. What those two wars, and really the late 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, did to France. If y'all know that history, it's pretty awful, pretty gruesome. And so he sees some connections there. And he's trying to connect his experience. Now, of course, it's not equitable because race is not quite involved in this conversation, and it doesn't necessarily come out. But he understands the sort of sorrow and experiences they've had. And he's looking at World War I and World War II as an analog, and he's trying to make these connections here. But he, in effect, I argue, is beginning to see himself as a crucial link between European ideas about culture and about transatlantic shared concepts of African American experience, of African American music, and in some ways he begins to see himself as a beacon of a new era in the history of popularity of black music in a transnational setting. And I argue by transforming his image at this moment from the black Chicago pop star known as Big Bill to Big Bill Broonzy, Mississippi Delta blues player, he is going to become a European celebrity in doing this. And Mississippi is a big part of this. Because for some, Broonzy's career is paradoxical. On the one hand, his life and music is about black blues and black Southern music. But on the other hand, he had spent the majority of his professional career in places like New York and Chicago and Los Angeles and these big cities and within these black communities and playing to sophisticated urban audiences, and hadn't played in some of these more rural areas much since he was a child. So he's kind of a paradox. What is he? What is he trying to teach folks here that he is? Well, the interesting thing about Big Bill's conception of who he is and who he's not is Europeans have their own idea about who Big Bill is. And this has a lot to do with how continental Europeans understand African American music and how folks in the United Kingdom understand African American music. Folks on the continent love jazz. They are obsessed with jazz music. And they see Broonzy and his blues, particularly the blues he recorded in the 30s and 40s, where big band swing was very popular and elements of that kind of creep into recorded blues. They see Broonzy as a precursor, his music as a precursor to jazz. And it's kind of like Wynton Marsalis says, right? If jazz is gumbo, the blues is the roux, right? They start to discover that. And through Broonzy, they think, well, maybe here's someone that can teach us about the history of jazz and help us better understand jazz, because something has happened to jazz in the 1940s and grows in the 1950s, and that is bebop. Folks don't like bebop for a number of reasons, and they think that Broonzy can be this sort of dichotomous key that will help them unlock how they understand jazz. Because they love New Orleans jazz and traditional jazz, and bebop has changed all of that. But Big Bill is from a time and from a place and from an era in which jazz was in its more traditional New Orleans form. So they start to bring him over in the early 1950s to perform with these, I did it, Chris. There it goes. With these bands that are jazz bands. And he leads them. They're backing bands. This is Graham Bell, an Australian jazz cat who plays all over Europe, becomes an extraordinarily popular museum. And he leads these jazz bands, especially in France, Belgium, and Holland. And he's happy to do so because he's touring Europe for the first time. But on the other hand, when you get to the United Kingdom, they have a different understanding about who Big Bill is. France, Belgium, Holland, they want jazz band Big Bill. They want Big Bill to explain to them about the importance of traditional jazz. But in the UK, they want Mississippi Delta blues. They want the Mississippi blues player. They know from the presence of Alan Lomax there, and that's kind of a long story too. Alan Lomax had been there on the BBC conducting all kinds of folklore broadcasts, teaching British folks about the history of the blues, particularly as it related to the Delta. So they have an idea about who Big Bill is, and they want Big Bill to be the embodiment of the Mississippi Delta player. And so here Big Bill arrives in Europe for the first time, and he's forced to negotiate this, whatever this means. So on the one hand, he will be the sort of leader of these big jazz bands in Holland and in France. But when he gets to the UK, he's also willing to get rid of the bands and just jump up there with his acoustic guitar in the same way that he had done in 1938. Well, it goes well for Big Bill, and it doesn't. Because the French are sort of confused by what they were told was supposed to be jazz. But Big Bill gets up there playing essentially blues music, but with jazz arrangements, we'll put it that way. And they're like, well, this doesn't sound like New Orleans jazz. This doesn't even sound like swing. But when he goes to England and they hear him perform for the first time as a solo male sort of Mississippi Delta player, they're blown away. They are absolutely floored by his prowess, by his experience, by his virtuosity, by his affable personality, by his repertoire, his deep repertoire. And it's in that juxtaposition between how the continent thinks about it. And if those of you who have traveled to Europe, continental Europe and island Europe, right, have different perspectives about who they are. Bill is enamored with the idea that he is a traditional Mississippi Delta player. And from that point on, for the rest of his career, he becomes that embodiment. And he will spend from 1951 till his death in 1958 touring the United States and then touring in Europe as that embodiment of the Mississippi Delta player. And that's one of the fascinating connections he has to Mississippi. And in the book, I trace how these audiences see him, right? And I use different types of sources to get at, well, man, I thought I was going to see a jazz band, and here's Big Bill like just ripping the neck off of this guitar and singing in this melisma and falsetto that you only really hear with Delta blues, and it just doesn't make any sense. And then he goes to Britain, and they think they're going to hear this jazz guy, and he's going to play these jazz numbers, but in fact, he shows up as a Mississippi Delta player. And the most important thing beyond this transformation that Bill's experiencing, as I mentioned earlier in the talk, night after night, performance after performance, Big Bill will stop between songs. He might play 2 or 3 songs. And then he'll talk about the inspiration for the song, as many folk artists do. And he would, in a pedagogical kind of way, start teaching these Europeans about the black experience in the United States. What's fascinating about it is it's not necessarily the black urban experience in Chicago, where he is, king of Chicago blues, and he's got Muddy Waters as his protege and all this stuff. But he's teaching them about black life in the United States South, particularly as it relates to the Mississippi Delta and his background in Arkansas. So throughout this period, you get through popular periodicals that jazz and blues aficionados and intellectuals in Europe are writing about. You get to see this transformation, and it's just out there, and they're developing this community. And what's important about that for a scholar like me is that they are the first community to write in an intellectual way about black American artists. They are creating this. Some of it is hagiography, right? They worship these guys. Some of it is romanticized authenticity. They're creating stories about these folks that don't exist. But they are creating a kind of canon of writing about black artists that had never really happened before. One of the first blues biographies will be published of Big Bill. It's really an autobiography. That is co-written by a Belgian jazz critic, and his biography will come out in 1955. So by identifying and engaging with European assumptions about African American music, Broonzy developed a new public celebrity rooted in the desires and misconceptions held by European audiences. Along the journey through the last decade of his career, he established important relationships that facilitated his success in a foreign land. But of course, his tours of Europe were not trouble-free, and they never were. He frequently experienced many of these difficulties he had in the U.S. Mismanagement of money, some malfeasance even, European racism, the uncertainty about his new audiences, language barriers, currency problems, all those types of things that go along with touring. But as Europeans began to see the blues as a distinct form away from jazz, and one rooted not in New Orleans or Louisiana, but so they thought in Mississippi, Broonzy embraced this and became more renowned than he ever had in his particular career. Now, I spent a lot of time in the book talking about what that means in terms of blackness versus whiteness, appropriation versus agency, authenticity versus how an artist, develops their craft and their art. But I'm not going to talk about that. What I do want to talk about is this. And Broonzy met in 1955 a woman named Pim van Eesvelt, and this is part of how I was able to get access to Broonzy's history in a way that no one else had up until this point. And Pim van Eesvelt was a costume designer in the sort of municipal theater in the city of Amsterdam in Holland. And she came from a working class family, and she was an enormous fan of Broonzy's music because word is spreading about this African American entertainer who keeps showing up in all these towns, just blowing people out with his blues, particularly with his guitar playing and his singing. So she had seen him in 1953 and had gone to one of his concerts. And then when she finally got to meet him, it was in his dressing room in 1955, and she says it was just sort of love at first sight. And they started a relationship. And for the next 3 years, about 3.5 years, she and Van Eesvelt had a very passionate, very difficult, very documented relationship. And he traveled often with her she traveled often with him when he was there touring. And the relationship produced a son named Michael on December 5th, 1956. And that's Michael right there. From 1955 to roughly his death in 1958, Broonzy wrote Pim about every week in a series of letters that Michael has. And there's about 60 of them. And in those, you see a love story, you see the travails of these two transnational folks trying to develop a relationship across racial lines, across an ocean, across cultural lines. He's quite a bit her senior, so across age lines. And it is a fascinating story. So Michael has been a big part of how I learned about Big Bill. And I'll finish the talk talking a little bit about Michael here coming up. Tracing Big Bill's rise from isolated obscurity to international celebrity reveals the ways in which popular culture can simultaneously subvert and reproduce hegemony. The arena performance became one of the first places where black artists became engaged in the American cultural marketplace, as that space within the market system really didn't require a whole lot of capital. If you were a performer and you had a song, you could get up there and do it. Black participation in this cultural marketplace was considerably limited by white control of the recording and production of music, ensuring that black artists like Big Bill rarely benefited financially from their artistry before the Second World War. At the same time, black artists like Broonzy stood at odds with folklorists and musicologists and academics and their control over how we think about music and its epistemological foundations. They shaped how we think about music and its connection to history. And at every turn, no matter where you look, whatever rock you kick up, Big Bill's pushing back against these forces. And he's doing it of his own accord and with his own agency. His lifelong reinvention as a musician, from old-time filler to country blues artist to black pop artist to American folk revivalist, and this European jazz Mississippi hero, European blues Mississippi hero, I argue it's a fascinating way to view how African American musicians made music, struggled to assert race pride, created manhood, cultivated economic independence in this music marketplace by defining their own niche within this music marketplace through creating celebrity, all in a place in the United States where he couldn't even vote, right? That's agency and that's power, and that's one of the things that I think for far too long his music history has remained on the margins of traditional history. And when you have folks who are marginalized, you need to look into alternative spaces. That's not me, that's Robin Kelly, if y'all know his work. But it's important to look, and Big Bill is one of these folks. He is an ambassador for blackness in the first half of the 20th century, and one of the most important blues artists of the era. This is one of my favorite shots of Big Bill. He would go and tell folks that this is how they played blues in Mississippi, alone by a piano with a glass of whiskey and a cigarette. And it's the quintessential image. This is actually taken in the basement of a Dutch club where he's playing for folks after hours because they used to like to take him out. Bill's a big drinker. You throw a couple drinks in him and he'd play all night. And so this is one of my favorite pictures of him. And it's a very powerful moment. Let me see. That's Michael on the left. That's Michael I think he's about 58 right there. And that's his dad. That's Big Bill playing his 1947 0028 Martin, for those of you who know those guitars. That guitar lives. That's Big Bill's Mississippi Delta acoustic guitar. It lives in the Old Town folk music, folk school in Chicago. Michael got to visit this guitar one day and took a picture of it, and there they are side by side. I spent some total of about 15 days with Michael and his family in Amsterdam, and in their possession, in a boot box, for those of you who have boots, they come in real big boxes. Under his bed and in his closet, Michael has all of those letters, ephemera, archival material that nobody's ever seen, because it is a personal story. Big Bill Broonzy is a personal story for Michael. And I'll finish on this. I had the chance to interview Michael about his father, and for a long time, he didn't like Big Bill. Big Bill died. Oh, that's telling me to shut up. He didn't like the fact that he never got to know his father. Michael was born in 56, and Big Bill died in 58. And for a long time, he resented that. And he would even go around telling folks that Big Bill was his father, and they wouldn't believe him. So when he reached 40 years old, he really started to have that kind of existential midlife, what does it all mean kind of thing, wanted to rediscover his roots and find out who he was. And Michael started to discover who his father truly was and explore the legacy of his father. And in doing so, began about a decade later, opening up his history and his life to folks like me. And there are more that came before me, and there will be more that come after. And it's been an invaluable experience to me, because what I saw is a community of people across a massive ocean who would never in a million years have the types of connections that man, Big Bill, created. And he is the center nexus of it all. And you see that in Michael, you see that in the archive that Michael has. And that's the moment as a historian where history no longer becomes academic, where it no longer becomes pedantic, where it becomes real. And Michael gave that experience to me. So Michael is a very special. Michael is Broonzy's only known heir, only known child. And he's still kicking it in Amsterdam. He's bigger than his dad. Big Bill was about 6'4", about 225. Michael's about 6'7", about 260. But do you see the resemblance at all? Yeah. And here we are. And Michael's, that's his wife, Bettina. Fascinating family, transnational family. Michael's half American, half Dutch. She's half French, half German. Their kids speak French, Dutch, German, English, and then American idiomatic expressions all the time. So it's a fascinating family. Thank you for listening. I'll take some questions now. Chris has a microphone in the back. I know that was a kind of all over the place talk. It's a big book, but I really wanted to think about blues in Mississippi in a transnational context, because Big Bill is one of these torchbearers who is taking what this place is and one of its true cultural art forms way, way out of the United States into other spaces. Thanks.
Thinking about the South Side of Chicago, there were two musical communities, the one that Big Bill represented,
Sure.
the nightclubs. There was also a Baptist church, and one of the names that comes out of that is Mahalia Jackson.
Oh, yeah, of course.
And I wondered, did the two have any relation? I mean, those two communities have any cross relationship?
Sure. Great question. Absolutely, they were pals. I talk about her in the book. The founding of the Old Town School of Folk Music, which becomes the kind of center of folk music activity. And this is especially as jazz and gospel and blues become not just performed and recorded music, but thought about, studied, taught music. Those two were kind of the founding members, Big Bill and Mahalia Jackson. And yeah, they toured together in Europe. They'd shared gigs together, and he would often try to get her to sing secular music, and she wouldn't do it. She could do it, but Big Bill is kind of a jokester, kind of a trickster, kind of a fun guy, and I'd like to give her a hard time. Yeah, great question.
I wonder if you would comment on his efforts as a protest singer, particularly in the song "Get Back."
Sure, Black, Brown, and White. Yeah,
That's it.
That's a great song. It is a protest song. It's an activist song, and he writes it. The interesting thing about that song is he writes it, I want to say 10 or 12 years before it's ever recorded, because he performs it, but no one would record it. And it really wasn't until he went to France that somebody would put it down on record, because of given the nature of it. But that's one of the reasons that, so he'll end up, one of the things I wanted to do with the book is because if he's hanging out with folks like Alan Lomax, and he's hanging out with folks like Win Strachey in Chicago, and Studs Terkel, and Woody Guthrie, and these guys, I mean, is this guy like, is he kind of a communist? Is he a socialist? I mean, does he sympathize with the labor movement? Because he was a laborer from the Delta, and ain't nobody know hard work like black folks laboring in that period in the Delta. So was he a sympathizer for the labor movement and all that? And I never found any of that. But it's those songs that you speak of that all those folks were really drawn to Big Bill, because he was not afraid to sing and perform those songs and write about those songs and talk. And an interesting moment happens in 1947 where Alan Lomax, Big Bill, John Lee Sonny Boy Williamson, and one more guy, who is it? It'll come to me. He takes them to New York and puts them in a recording studio, and Lomax has an agenda. He tells them he's going to sit down, we're going to do a session, I want you three guys to play with each other. And but he starts feeding them gin and bourbon, and they play. But then he starts asking them a bunch of questions, and it becomes Blues in the Mississippi Night, which is one of the first recordings of black men, right, speaking openly about Jim Crow segregation in the Delta. And they talk about lynching, they talk about rape, they talk about all of the horrors of Jim Crow South, and it's Big Bill doing most of the talking. What he doesn't know at the time is that's why Alan Lomax wants him there to record that stuff, because he knows Big Bill will give him a little bit something to drink and he'll start talking about that stuff. But it's a historic moment, and it's one of the first times, arguably the first time, that an African-American man goes on an oral history and talks about the horrors of the Jim Crow South. Yeah, you are. And they called it Blues in the Mississippi Night, because the way Alan Lomax sold it is these three guys sitting down in the Delta on a log drinking moonshine, talking about, they're actually in a New York studio, recording these songs. And that's Lomax for you, though, but it's an important recording. Thanks for that question. Great question.
I'd like to reinforce your point about how much the French love blues.
Oh, there we are, yeah.
Because when I moved there in the 1990s, I was just so very impressed by the number of blues clubs that are around Paris.
Sure.
And they just are enamored with it.
Right. An interesting thing so they knew blues and jazz, particularly jazz, before the Second World War, because, Josephine Baker is in France before really the rise of Nazism. And there's a lot of fanfare within Germany of black music and black dance styles, particularly jazz. But it's through jazz and through Broonzy that these folks start to discover the blues, because they think they're like this. And Broonzy explains to them that they walk parallel paths, but they're not necessarily the same. And the French, and that's one of his gifts but it's happening in Belgium and in Germany as he's touring there, and in Holland, of course, and really all over continental Europe. And it's a very powerful thing. And the thing to me is he's still there, right? Broonzy's name is still there, and these blues guys that toured are still there. And it's very popular. It's a great point.
I can understand Big Bill leaving the South and going north because of the horrors of racism in the South, and going north. Went to New York, but is there a connection between the Harlem Renaissance, which is New York,
Sure.
and he and his music around the time of the Harlem Renaissance?
Great.
We're talking about the early 20th century.
Sure.
Is there a connection between his music and what he does and the Harlem Renaissance? And, secondly, how is he able to, in Europe, French, German, Spanish, and a whole lot of languages, how is he, and I imagine that his only language is English, how is he able to relate to the Germans and the French and the Dutch and the Portuguese and all the other languages that we hear
Great.
that is being spoken
Sure.
in Europe?
Part one, the first, probably third of the book, I do make the argument that blues artists should be considered as part of the pantheon of the members of the New Negro Renaissance. What's going on in State Street and Bronzeville is different than what's happening in Harlem. It's the same time period, but like all cities, those types of cultural formations, those types of artistic expressions and explosions and transformations in black identity happen in different ways. And I make the argument that Big Bill's is a part of that, and specifically to Chicago. One of the things that I like to use as a device to talk about that, the New Negro movement, is the creation of these music communities, right? Where there are recording studios, venues of performance, but there are also these buffet flats and rent parties that are after-hours places. And those are the places where up-and-coming musicians meet new musicians, like Muddy Waters meets Big Bill. They sit down and exchange ideas together, and that's how music and formation, things evolve. In the same way that poets and artists and writers are doing that in Harlem, blues musicians and jazz musicians are doing that in Chicago, because those are the two recording capitals of the United States in the period. And Chicago is drawing, because of the transportation infrastructure, is drawing folks from Arkansas, Mississippi, Texas, and the like, whereas New York is getting more folks from the East Coast and the South, the Upper South, I guess you could say, and going in that direction. So it's a different flavor of the Harlem New Negro Renaissance. But current historiography is looking at that. They're arguing that if you go spatially to Boston or to Philadelphia or Los Angeles or to Atlanta or to Chicago or to New York or to wherever black folks live, even maybe in the Caribbean, for example, during that period, because of the artistic formation, the literary transformation that's taken place, and the kind of the rise of Jim Crow segregation all happening at one time, these new Negro movements are popping up everywhere. It just depends on how you define them. So yes, I make that argument. And the second piece of your question, remind me the second piece of your question again.
As an
Language, right. Great question. He has handlers. He has folks that, and that box, the archive that I was telling you about, is filled with correspondence, not just between Pym and Big Bill, but between those who handle him as he goes from France to Holland to Belgium to Germany to Spain to the UK. And they're all communicating with each other saying Big Bill got here, or Big Bill will be here, or Big Bill's stuck in Scotland and we're trying to get him down to London, but we can't. that whole collection is filled with that correspondence. And that's what's fascinating as a music historian to see, as a community of folks, as you say, who don't necessarily know each other, don't even speak the same languages, are all connecting across different spaces to get Big Bill to where he needs to be. And it's a fascinating thing to see. Great question.
Hi.
Hey.
I'm Brenda Willis. I'm one of the 3 Mrs. Chick Willis.
Oh, okay.
And I got to travel with him a lot to Europe and especially to Holland. But I also, in the later years, became familiar and friends with Willie Dixon.
Oh, sure,
and the Willie Dixon Blues Heaven Foundation.
Great.
So I'm really concerned about who owns the rights to Big Bill's music.
That's a great question. Michael would love for it to be him, or at least partly for it to be him. And he has gone back and forth with a few attorneys about that. Nobody knows, to put it simply. Some of the record companies do. Some folks, he still has. So his mother stayed in Arkansas, and he still has distant relatives in Arkansas that I think are there now. But nobody knows. It's in limbo, we'll put it that way. That's a great question, because it is troublesome to Michael, who is, his only known child, and who knows, Big Bill may be like BB and have several out there that nobody knows anything about. But I don't know. He doesn't know either. And he's actually talked to me about that. I'm like, man, I'm a historian, I'm a scholar, I don't know about that particular world. But it is something of a concern to him, because it's part of his catharsis, his coming to terms with who he is, and his dad is being responsible for that legacy. Because in so many ways, he is responsible for that legacy now. Because as I mentioned before, he's been on BBC documentaries. A couple folks, researchers and a couple of documentary production companies have sent him to the States, toured him through Chicago, through Arkansas and all that. And he really wants to become involved with that. And if you have ideas about that, about how to get at that, I'd love to hear that. So would he.
Please contact the Willie Dixon Blues Heaven Foundation in Chicago. They are in the Bronzeville area.
Okay, great. Thank you.
We have come to the top of another hour. I know there are more questions, but I suspect that Kevin will be glad to talk with you after and answer those. A convenient place to have that conversation is right here where we're selling copies of his book.
Nicely done.
And then years ago, for the State History Museum, Chrissy Wilson worked with Petty Car Black and others on the exhibit All Shook Up, Mississippi Roots of American Popular Music. This was the book that accompanied that. If you purchase Kevin's book today, you will get this for free. Chrissy's here. You can even get her to sign it as well. Thank you all for coming. Help me thank Kevin Greene, and I hope we see you next week.